What's up? I'm Jay Moss, and in the last video we looked at Birthright from Baltimore, Maryland, and we looked at all of these dynamic tricks we did. In this video we're going to look at the exact same mix, but instead this time I want to just concentrate on the stereo bus. So your stereo bus or your master fader or whatever you want to call it, it's essentially just the final destination for your mix. When I first started mixing I was really intimidated of it. Older engineers would be like, don't put anything on it, don't mess with it. As I've grown into my own style of engineering, I start there now. A lot of people think it's crazy. I call it mixing backwards. I'm sure there's other terms for it. But in this video, let's kind of mix backwards. To be totally honest and totally forthcoming, there are a few things that I do before I start treating the stereo bus fader, but there's not a lot. Really, it's just I make sure everything's in phase. I make sure things are generally leveled, and I make sure things are sort of panned how I want them to be panned. And then after that, I start to get to work shaping the whole mix. I think you'll be pretty blown away by how a heavy-handed approach on the master bus can really make your mix totally transform. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, the stereo fader is this red one all the way on the right. Going forward, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit this button, which pops up something bigger, something easier for us to look at, and I'll play it over my tracking window. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the whole mix, and then I'm going to bypass everything on my stereo bus, and then I'm going to turn it back on, and you can check it out. The one thing I'm not going to bypass is my limiter, which we have here. I just want to make sure that our levels are pretty consistent. It'll be easier to understand the benefits of what I'm doing if you don't have this huge volume discrepancy between the two. So just know that that is on. Okay, so here's literally the exact same mix. The only difference is nothing on the stereo bus, but everything on my individual channels and everything on my group buses, all of that stuff is the same. The only difference is nothing on the stereo bus. Is that not crazy? How exceptionally unfinished does that sound? So now that you see what a monumental difference working on your stereo bus can have, I'm just going to walk you through step by step, my thought process, how I landed where I landed, what everything does. This isn't going to be super in depth, but this is at least going to give you an idea of what I like to use, why I like to use it, how I use it, and what the benefits are. Let's do this. First plugin. GoFast. I've mentioned this in other videos. This plugin and the concept of this plugin sort of represents like this new wave that's going on all over the world, really, but like definitely going on with audio, and that's AI-based software, and this is an AI-based EQ. So basically what this plugin does is it's just going to analyze everything as it comes in, and it's going to make adjustments. I want you to remember these numbers. We ended up on Recover 41 in Tame 42, and we're going to bring these down to 0 and work our way back up. As you can see, the plugin is now no longer trying to do anything. Let's play the mix, and I usually start with Tame, and then I add some Recover. I want you to watch the vocal right here when I play it again. You're going to see the vocal, every time the vocal comes in, it's going to make an intelligent little dip. That's going to push the mid-range in. It's going to make the vocal sit into the mix a little bit better. It's giving us a little lift. The other thing that it's doing is it's very gently pressing down our low end. And the reason that it's doing that is because the bass guitar is pretty loud in this mix. GoFast recognizes that and just nudges it down a little bit in order to maintain a better mix balance. Now let's add some Recover. Cool, so you can see a lot adding up here in the super high end. That's like expensive sounding frequencies. And we also got some other, I think these are like the secondary expensive frequencies. These are the super lows. When they're done right, it makes the mix sound really pro and really modern. Overall, what I like about this plugin is it adds a little sense of sheen. And of course, I could have gone in and I could have found frequencies and I could have notched them, but not as accurately, right? Because even though it's screaming, the pitches of the screams are dynamic. And that's why when the vocals came in and you saw that little notch out, it would move around a little bit based on the pitch of the scream. That's something that would be really, really hard to emulate with almost any EQ. I know there's like the Surfer EQ and stuff like that, but this approach is super simple. And I think a little bit goes a really long way. Let's move on. Okay, so the next plugin we're going to look at, this is the Greg Wells Mixcentric. A lot of people have a lot of opinions on this plugin. I think it's awesome. You have to know its strengths and weaknesses though. You can see this is a ridiculous setting. I named it JM Cranked and I give it a little bit more input volume, but I use it like this all the time. So I'm going to turn this on and this is going to be totally severe. And you might think that I just ruined the mix. And what we're going to hear the guitars and we're going to hear the high mid-range in general just kind of go overboard. But trust me, I've experimented with this a lot. And even though it seems kind of counterintuitive, you'll see the measures that we take after this to kind of correct this. People use this all different types of ways. This is a very bold approach, but it's an approach I like. Here we go. We're going to go without it and I'm going to turn it on and then your ears are going to bleed. Okay, so that probably seemed like not a good idea at all. And I understand if you wouldn't want to go that far with it. But stay with me on this one. I could see how someone would have an approach where they're like, okay, I'm not going to use that much of it. I could see how their next step would be like, well, let me just now adjust the things that seem to be the most going crazy. But what I'm going to do is I'm literally just going to adjust the whole mix to compensate a little bit. The next couple steps I do are going to do that. Okay, so here we have a giant instance of Soothe. As you can see, the preset on this one is called JMOS Greg Wells Correction. And you're going to see that I have it most specifically looking for frequencies in the high mid range. That's where the offense was. But we're going to cover almost the entire frequency range that people can hear all at the same time. When I'm doing dynamic notching like this, I like to keep my settings as high as possible. So our oversamples up to 4x, our resolution's ultra. With tiny little notches like this, it can create aliasing and some unwanted artifacts. So keeping this stuff pumped up really helps. Let's start with it off again and I'll turn it on. And I want you to really focus on the upper mid range and it's just going to chill out a little bit. And this is going to be one of a couple steps we use to make our way back towards a balanced mix with the benefits of Greg Wells. So you're probably starting to see a trend. I kind of like these AI-based like dynamic EQs that respond to the program material. I think it's cool. I think it's really bleeding edge and really smart. This is a perfect example of something that we do in the digital domain now that like we just couldn't do before in the analog domain, and not to this extent. So I say lean on it, try it, use it, and moving on again. This is the Slate Digital FG Gray, which is basically the SSL bus compressor emulation. Waves has one. I'm sure UAD has one. There's a bunch. I like this one over the Waves one for a couple reasons, and that all lives over here. The high pass filter is invaluable, and I like having a mix knob. Even though I'm going 100% mix this time, to be able to wet dry is totally a lifesaver. For this example, I really want you to listen to the snare drum. When I engage this, you should really hear the snare start to sit in the mix. Once again, I have a preset that I really like here. It's basically high passing around 100 hertz, 101 hertz, and ratios in between 3 and 4. 3 and 5, I guess it's exactly in between 3 and 4. Based on my mix, I will adjust the threshold I think we just have a few dB of gain reduction here, which is pretty typical for something like this, but I think it makes a big difference. I really like the way that the snare drum starts to sink down into the mix. It starts to live with the rest of the instruments. It's really common for us to mix with the snare drum kind of high in modern music, and while it's still very pronounced and like very discernible, I like it to just sort of be like glued in there a little bit better. This does a really great job of that. So what's next? We're going to use a multiband compressor. We're going to chill the high end a little bit more dynamically, and we're going to warm things up. I have a preset for this as well, and I really like this for controlling the low end, keeping that kick drum nice and tight, keeping that high end nice and tight, and then rebalancing that mid-range, leaning a little bit warmer since we are sort of mid-range heavy at the moment. So as described, I'm gonna turn this off, and then when we play, what you should hear is the low end tighten up. You should hear a shift here. You can kind of already see it, but you'll see these things moving. We're going to be a little bit warmer and a little bit less irritating, and the high end is going to come to life just a little bit more. Pretty awesome, right? Like the drums totally sit better in the mix now. The whole thing also feels kind of like pumpier, which I know can be a bad term, but for rock music, when used correctly, I think pumping is actually awesome. Also, I want you to pay attention to the fact that with the exception of the mix-centric plugin, all the other plugins are reacting to the program material, right? Like Gullfoss is, Soothe is, this Fab MB is totally reacting. Our compression reacts to the input signal. So like all of this stuff is breathing with the mix. I like stuff like that. I really like doing all of these dynamic corrections before I finally go in with a more traditional parametric EQ and do some static shaping just to finish off what we've started. Okay, so this is our last plugin, and I want you to look at something. I'm only doing 1.5 dB here, 1.2 dBs here. This one's about -2. That one's about 1.5 dB there. But because they're sort of working in opposition to one another, check out how much warmer and how much better the mix gets just by applying these tiny cuts at the end of all the correction we've done so far. Here we go. Start with it off, and then I'll pop it on. And that's it. We did it. That's everything I did to the stereo bus to make an enormous improvement on this mix. I know when I first turned on FabFilter at the end, you're like, ooh, that sounds a little bit dark. But then when I turned it off, you're probably like, oh, my ears are bleeding. That was actually the right thing to do. Admittedly, some of this was a little bit extra corrective because I did totally crank the Greg Wells plugin all the way. But I still found that the cost-benefit ratio of doing that totally paid off. So what we did is we intelligently and subtly, in multiple instances, corrected for the things I didn't like about that, kept all the parts that I did, and the mix totally slams. With that, I am Jay Moss. Happy mixing. I hope you learned something. I hope I didn't ramble too much. Adios.